Hey, good morning, Audra.
Good morning, and I'm trying to make sure I got this streaming thing correct.
Okay. If you don't worry about it because we can always stream it later after we're over with. So don't put any pressure on yourself, okay?
Okay, I think it's working. I'm just gonna go in a different room so I don't hear myself speak.
Okay. Yeah, that is one of the problems that I run into with ours is you got about a 30-second delay, and then yeah, it really echoes really bad. Get a lot of feedback.
Yeah, yeah, it's all the way in my other room, so I think we're good.
Well, thank
I'm
you so
excited for
much.
today.
We really appreciate you stepping in like this.
No problem. My pleasure. I'm excited for the conversation.
Here in a couple of minutes at 9:55, I'll start some music.
All right.
Instagram.
Welcome to Coffee with Democrats, a sensible platform for progressive conversations. Coffee with Democrats is a grassroots movement dedicated to hearing from Democrats, candidates, legislators, and friends from all political backgrounds who want great conversations. Coffee with Democrats is committed to increase Democrat voter registration and Democrat voter turnout by making voting more exciting and meaningful. And now here's your host of Coffee with Democrats, Kevin Dawson.
Well, hey, good morning, everybody. This is going to be an exciting, very exciting and eventful conversation today. So we're going to preface this by saying that we got notified late last night that our son and his wife is in labor in Illinois, and we are traveling to Illinois to be there to greet our brand new grandson, who will be here sometime today. So we are traveling there, and on the way, we decided we're going to stop and we're going to do Coffee with Democrats in a parking lot in Afton, Oklahoma, and have this great conversation with one of the really fantastic Democrats for the United States, Ken Martin. And we are just so excited to have this conversation. So the whole family is in the car with me. The dogs are in the car with me. And we're just going to do Coffee with Democrats on the side of the road, not literally on the side of the road, but we are so happy to be here, and we want to welcome everybody for this Coffee with Democrats, this conversation. So again, we want to welcome everybody. We want to find out what kind of coffee people are drinking and what their favorite coffees are. But we'll get started by saying good morning, Ken. Thank you for joining us. We are just overwhelmed with excitement, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and especially on this amazingly special day for you. It sounds like, is this your first grandchild, by the way?
No, this is going to be grandchild number 5.
Oh, wow. Well, still, nonetheless, it's an exciting day, and congratulations in advance.
Well, thank you so much, and it is so much of an honor to be with you in person. We were together in Tulsa. We met, we shook hands, we embraced. Yes. It was such a great conversation that we had. And so I extended the invitation for you to come on Coffee with Dems and join us in this conversation and have a little bit more of an extended conversation. But we're going to try to work through these technical issues. I'm getting some feedback on my side. So we're just going to work through this. We blame everything technical on Elon Musk. It's all his fault. So we're going to blame him for any technical issues that we're having. There, it seems like it kind of drew down a little bit. For housekeeping purposes, for the people who are listening, we're not going to be able to get to all the conversation or the questions that everybody might have in person. But if you would, there's a question bubble down. Possibly can. So, Ken, what kind of coffee are you drinking today?
You know, I haven't had my coffee yet today, to be honest with you. I normally have a cup at home, just a regular straight black coffee, the way I like it. But I also tend to start my day here at the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party headquarters, with an energy drink, which has been something that keeps me going throughout the day. So, you know, hopefully everyone's enjoying a cup of coffee right now, and hopefully you don't spill it on yourself. I say something stupid and you spit it out. So.
Well, I don't think we're going to worry too much about that. But it's interesting, though. About having black coffee. Black coffee seems to be that mainstay for people who grew up in rural places, and you grew up in Minnesota. You want to talk just a little bit about growing up in Minnesota?
Yeah, it's obviously a lot like Oklahoma in some ways. It's a very rural state. It's our number one industry is agriculture for sure. And when speaking of coffee, I started drinking coffee probably when I was 14 years old, and that's my dad and grandfather. That's how they drank their coffee, and I suppose that's why I drink my coffee that way. I don't know, but I will tell you that Minnesota. It's a great state, a great progressive state, an island of blue in the upper Midwest. We're surrounded by fairly red states, and I think there's a lot that we've done over many years now, not just this last legislative session, which I know we'll talk a little bit about, but frankly, over decades, we've been a leader in so many ways on so many critical issues, and I'm proud to be from a state that produced folks like Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale and my mentor and friend Paul Wellstone and folks like Amy Klobuchar. Some of the biggest national names in Democratic politics have called Minnesota home, and I'm just grateful to be a part of continuing that legacy here in Minnesota and making sure that we build upon it. So,
I used to work in. If you don't mind, Ken, when I'm, I think we're getting some feedback. You'll mute while I ask a conversation here, or I ask a question. It seems like we're getting some feedback, so we'll play some tag back and forth on that mute button. And again, I apologize. I used to work a little bit up in St. Paul, South St. Paul, where the Union Pacific Railroad offices were at down there, just on the other side of the river. It was very interesting, and I've worked from there. Oh man, all over Minnesota, all the way down into Iowa. That was one of my mainstays, and I love the winters in Minnesota. Everybody talks about how harsh it is up there, but it is just a really beautiful place to go. So it's great. You left Minnesota for a short time, went to KU down in Kansas. What was that
I did.
about? What was that about?
Well, look, I mean, it's a great university, of course, and Lawrence is one of the best towns in Kansas, I believe. Of course, Douglas County, where that's at, is one of the bluest counties in the state of Kansas. I will tell you, though, early in my organizing years in politics were spent in Kansas politics, and also in the South. I did work in Oklahoma and Missouri and in Arkansas for Clinton Gore in '92. And so, for me, I will tell you that working in what was then a very red state of Kansas really helped teach me a lot about politics, frankly. And the one thing that really was my key takeaway from my time in Kansas is that, there were so few Democrats that they didn't really have the luxury to be divided on issue or from an ideological spectrum. They had to be united. They had to stay united, whether they were conservative Democrats or leftist Democrats or anything in between. For them to actually build power and win elections, they knew that they had to maybe put aside some of their differences and come together and be unified in their goal of electing Democrats to office to help them improve people's lives. And that exercise in building power is really an important piece that I hope the Democratic Party across the country realizes. We are a big tent. We are, by the nature of our party, we're a coalition party, and I believe that we win elections through addition, not subtraction. And what that means for us is we have to be welcoming to all types of Democrats. There's no one stripe or one way of being a Democrat. And that's really, for me, that's what Kansas Democrats taught me so many years ago, which is, we may be small, but we're mighty, and we're mightier when we stick together.
Oh, absolutely. And I love the way that you said that. That was very insightful. It's something that we have to really pay attention to going forward as Democrats, is not allow the rhetoric from the Republican Party to divide us. And so let's talk just a little bit about, for about 100 years, I talk a little bit about Oklahoma in general because that's where I live. But if we put into a little bit of a broader spectrum, because you did bring up Kansas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma and the Midwest, there's kind of this Midwest theme that over 100 years, the Midwest was pretty well dominated by Democrats, and then slowly it's been shifting, and then we just kind of had this sudden surge about 15 years ago where it just surged red. And so when we look at, for the first 100 years, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri were somewhat dominated by Democrats. Now that that's ended and it's become dominated by Republicans, what do you think has been the driving force behind people in the Midwest to become a Republican? And this is kind of a different question because, we come from a question of we're Democrats, but really let's put ourselves in that other foot and that other side. What is attracting people to Republicans?
Well, I think it's a great question, and there's a myriad of answers to that, to be honest with you, and no one has quite figured this piece out. But what I would say is there's a great book by Dr. Catherine Kramer, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, called "The Politics of Resentment," and the subtitle is "The Rise of Scott Walker and Donald Trump in Rural Wisconsin." It's a really fascinating read because I think as you read through that, you will see that so many parts of our country that used to be, pretty democratic have moved over the last 40 to 50 years or longer. And for a whole host of reasons, as I mentioned, but part of it, again, as I keep reminding folks, we can't just be the party of the highly educated or the most densely populated areas in our state. We have to be a statewide party. We have to be a national party. We have to compete for votes in every zip code. And that means we need to recognize that there are folks in rural parts of our state, rural parts of our country who feel forgotten and left behind. People who feel like they used to vote for the Democrats, their parents were Democrats, but they stopped voting for the Democrats because they don't believe that we're fighting for them or that we care. And I'll share my own story with you. My father-in-law is a farmer down in southern Minnesota, down in Wells, Minnesota. Their families farmed that land for 135 years. And he's 85 years old, and he voted for Trump both in 16 and in 20. And I'm sure there's many of your listeners who also had family members that voted the other way in both of those elections. But, he's 85 years old, should be on the tail, he's on the tail end of his life here. He should be living carefree without a knot of anxiety in the world, right? And after those Trump elections, I asked him why he voted for Trump. There's not a racist bone in this guy's body. He's one of the nicest men I've ever met in my life, salt to the earth farmer. But as he started to tell his story, it really, really dawned on me what's happening, not just in his life, but frankly, a lot of people's lives in the rural parts of our country. And, he said, look, my wife has Parkinson's disease. I have to drive further now, about 100 miles further to find care for her because the clinic in town closed. His high school, which he went to, my wife went to, has now closed and consolidated with other rural communities. There's no Friday night football games anymore for him to go to. The church that I was married in, that their family helped build, the Catholic church in town, has also closed, and now they have to drive further to go to mass. The downtown is drying up. Businesses aren't locating there. You can go through the whole host of all of this. At the end of the day, here's this guy who should be carefree, and he's got a knot of anxiety in his gut about what the future looks like, right? None of his kids, my wife included, want to come home and farm the land. There's no young people left in the community. This is a familiar story for probably many of your listeners, right? Well, so for him, along comes this snake oil salesman named Donald Trump, right, saying, let's make America great again. And while we all know what Donald Trump really meant with that saying, the reality is that for someone who's anxious about their future and nostalgic for the past, of course, there was some resonance there to that message. And he felt like he was talking directly to him. And he felt like people cared about him and his life. And so as simple as this might sound, to be honest with you, the reality is we have to show people in rural parts of our country that we're willing to stand up and fight for them, that we understand what's happening with the rural cities and towns, that we understand what's happening with communities that are drying up and dying, and that we are going to fight for those communities, and we're going to fight for people wherever they are. And I'll just say, for me, I had the great fortune to work for Paul Wellstone, and Paul could organize, corn farmers in southern Minnesota. He could go up to the Iron Range and organize the miners up there, come into the inner city and organize immigrant communities and communities of color. And he had, I think, a sense that there was more that united those very disparate communities than did not. And part of that was the idea of the American dream, that if you work hard and play by the rules, that you should be able to achieve that. And unfortunately, there's barriers in the way for people to achieve that. And those barriers exist for people in rural parts of our country as well. And we have to acknowledge that. And they have to see us both present on the ground in those communities, and they have to see us fighting for them. And when we're not talking about farmers or people who live in rural towns or others who used to vote for us, they believe that we forgot them, and they're already feeling forgotten. And if they don't hear us talking about them or showing up in their communities and trying to earn their vote, they're certainly not going to vote Democratic. So anyways, that was a long answer to your short question, and maybe too simplistic and easy of a prescription here. But I think the first way to start, as Confucius once said, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one small step. I think that one small step for us as Democrats is to make sure that we're present and active and visible in rural communities throughout this country.
Well, really, that was yeah, and it was a great answer. It was really it goes to the crux of why we really wanted to invite you to come on and talk about it, is your commitment to rural America, and you really you took us there. That's exactly the kind of response that we want to have, because just like what we hear from David Pepper, you and I were in Tulsa together with David Pepper, and he's got a great book out there about saving democracy. And that's the same thing he says. And that's the same message we need to be putting out with Coffee with Democrats. And as all Democrats, even the state of Oklahoma, the state of Arkansas, no matter where we are, we need to be saying the same thing. Let's run every single race.
Yeah, let me say something about my friend David Pepper too, because one of the things he's really he did a great job as the chair of the Ohio Democratic Party, but more importantly, in the work that he's doing right now is really eye-opening to folks around this country in terms of what the conservative movement has done, because we've been somewhat negligent in building infrastructure throughout the country the right way. The Republicans and the conservative movement in this country really is dismantling democracy, even at the basic level. School boards and city councils, county commissions throughout our states are being taken over by Republicans and and conservatives with a very dogmatic agenda. And I would say that we have to do better as a Democratic Party of realizing that it's not just in our self-interest to recruit candidates to run for these positions so we can groom them for office down the road and run them for higher office. That's certainly an ancillary benefit, but we need to be competing in these spaces because we are losing major public policy battles in these public policy arenas. And David Pepper, to his credit, is talking about this assault on democracy. Oftentimes, we focus on things like the January 6th insurrection and these election deniers running for office and all these other pieces, which are obvious threats right in front of our eyes. But the less obvious stuff is what's happening underneath the radar of most of us, where the conservatives are really taking over almost all levers of government, and then in a very insidious way trying to destroy democracy from the inside. To David's credit, he's been talking about this. I wish more people listen to him. And for your followers who don't know David Pepper, please follow him and listen to him, because he's very insightful onto how we restore democracy in this country.
Thank you for the comment about David, because he's a great friend of ours. He was on our Coffee with Dems Ohio chapter here about 3 weeks ago, and he is a great speaker, and he's so very good, and very much like yourself, very articulate. And we really appreciate that. Audrey, I think you've got a question coming from Connecticut.
Yeah, so I'm from Connecticut, but I'm actually going to ask a little bit more about your comment about the rural areas, which I 100% agree with, and believe, especially in these rural areas, one of the best ways that the national party can support Democrats in these rural areas is through financially supporting the Democratic candidates who are running to represent in these areas. And I'm wondering, I've seen, that there is a gap there oftentimes in, local candidates, Democratic candidates running for, say, a House district office, whatever the case may be, who, would in fact probably would do a really good job at getting elected, and once elected, be a really great representative of the Democratic Party, but lack the financial support from the Democratic committee, from the Democratic Party. So I'm wondering if there's, when we're talking about supporting and showing up, to what extent are we, or is the party planning to, or can they work towards, showing up both in being present physically, but even more importantly, being present financially for these, rural candidates who are running in down ballot races that really need that support from the national committee?
Well, thank you for that question, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's one of my chief frustrations about the National Party. And as a vice chair of the DNC, I'm sort of Johnny One Note in these meetings with our chair and with the other officers, because, we have a whole host of, as I call it, the alphabet soup of committees in Washington, D.C., right? The DCCC, the DSCC, the DGA, DLCC, the DAS, DAGA. You can go down the list of all these, and I'm sure you know some of them. But the reality is some of the groups that they're not helping out are groups like the Democratic Municipal Officials, right? Which is a group of an organization focused on helping get candidates elected to city councils and mayoralships throughout the country. Democratic Mayors is another organization focused on helping get mayors elected throughout the country. Groups like the NDCO, the National Democratic County Officials, right? There are groups out there that are organized, that are desperate for resources, who I've been working with our association, which I'm proud to lead, the Association of State Democratic Committees, to help strategize and figure out ways that we can get them more resourced. And I think this is one of the big challenges for the Democratic Party. Frankly, we've had 30 to 40 years of just outright negligence on building deep down ballot, right? And, we have to not only contest every race for the reasons I mentioned earlier, there's also a lot of evidence that shows when you're running candidates at those local levels, it also helps you up ballot. It creates an uplift for those candidates, creates a center of gravity, and galvanizing local energy and volunteers around a candidate and campaign. So when we're not contesting those races, it actually impacts those top of the ticket races as well. So the point is we have a symbiotic and a really important relationship there. I would say that, frankly, this is true not only of folks in DC, but a lot of our folks in states. They focus on races, state legislative and above, or just federal races. Certainly folks in DC are mainly focused on federal races, on congressional races, Senate races, the presidency. And if we're going to build our party for the long term, we absolutely have to resource these organizations who are trying to provide funding to those local candidates. Otherwise, at some point, we wonder why we're in this place where, as you look at a map, it's just these, big blue dots and the rest of the country red. Well, it's because we've given up on those spaces. And as long as I'm involved in the party, I'm not willing to give up on wide swaths of this country where we know we can win these races if we just put in some semblance of an effort and put some money and time and energy into it. And I'll leave you with this. I won't leave you. I'll just end this answer with this, which is, Howard Dean probably was the best national party chair, followed, I think, by Jamie Harrison, who's doing a great job. But Howard understood that if we're going to turn a red area to a purple area, to a blue area, we have to spend some time, energy, and money in those areas. It's not just going to happen organically. And I believe the same thing. And part of that is making sure that some of this resource, I mean, look, they're talking about this presidential campaign probably costing anywhere between, on all sides, $5 to $10 billion. I mean, imagine if you just spent a fraction of that on helping some of these organizations get money and resource to local candidates. So I couldn't agree with you more. I don't have the answer, but I certainly know that all of us need to be singing from the same sheet of music on this one. We need to let folks know that have those checkbooks and have the resources, that the way we build for the future is deep down ballot.
And that was a fantastic answer, and thank you so much for that. When you and I met in Tulsa, it was right after you gave such a very inspiring speech to all of the delegates for the Oklahoma Democratic Convention, and I was really inspired by that. That I wanted to go up and I wanted to shake your hand and have that one-on-one contact and meet and greet with you. And my comment that I made to you is when we spoke is, and I issued a complaint that, as Oklahomans, we feel like we've been surrendered by the GOP to the GOP by the DNC. And we rarely get high profile Democrats to come to Oklahoma, and we seem financially forgotten, which is exactly what you just spoke to. But you said to me, and it was so, it was with such confidence. It wasn't arrogant. It was not arrogant. I want to say that up front to everybody that's listening. You didn't come across arrogant whatsoever, but it was so matter of fact. You said, that's not correct. We're here. We are here to help. And that really was one of those reassuring moments for me that I was, it kind of took me back, but it was like, yes, that is exactly the kind of message that we need to have out here. So can you further explain that? And I think you probably just answered that in the previous question, but I want to just.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, the reality is that there are national Democrats, myself included, and others, the chairman as well, who believe passionately that we have to be organizing in every zip code. And we, certainly a state like Oklahoma, while it may appear red on paper right now, it wasn't too long ago, as you remember well, that they were electing Democrats in both to Congress and to the U.S. Senate, to governorships, et cetera. And that's true of states that surround me, like North Dakota and South Dakota and Iowa. And so you can't give up on these areas. It's the same people, and their values, I would say, are still more aligned with the Democratic Party. And we have to be there. We have to be present, and that's what I said. I mean, the first step is being present and making sure people know that you care and that you want to partner and that you're there to help. The second and harder step, I think, nationally is for some of our committees and other organizations to understand that we have to have a longer term lens. And what do I mean by that? I'll use a hockey analogy, which I think, as a Minnesotan, I'm required to do. But Wayne Gretzky once said that you have to skate to where the puck will be and not where the puck is. And I think that that's what I really want to challenge national Democrats to start thinking about, and Democrats in every state, is that we're not focused just on 24 right now. We shouldn't be. We should be focused on 26, 28, and 30. We have an opportunity, if we're thinking the right way, to build towards, maybe one of these districts isn't going to flip right now, but the population trends, the electoral trends, other things happening on the ground suggest that over time it will, right? With the little time, energy, and money. And so we have to be, have enough foresight to realize that we can win some of these areas back if we have a longer term lens. Unfortunately, and I don't blame folks, because, the national committees are focused on next November, as they should be. But there has to be some entity that is strategically thinking about what the next decade looks like for Democrats and how we're building power up and down the ballot so that we can actually, continue to improve people's lives. And let me say this. You heard me say this, of course. None of us are engaged in this to win elections. And when I say, well, I'm not here to win elections, people say, what the hell are you talking about? You're the chair of the DFL, a vice chair of the DNC. What do you mean you're not here to win elections? Well, for me, winning elections is just the beginning, right? It's not my end goal. And I don't think it's any of your end goal, right? Our goal is actually to get people elected to office who share our values so they can pass good public policy to improve communities and change people's lives for the better. That is my goal. That's what drives me. And at the end of the day, I think that's what drives most Democrats. And so for us, we have to be thinking much longer term than just this upcoming election and patting ourselves on the back if we win an election, right? What good is power if we don't use it? Power is fleeting, and we have to build power longer term so we can use it while we have it to make the biggest difference for as many people as we can. This is something I've talked a lot about lately because we did that here in Minnesota with our trifecta. I wish other states would do that when they come into power, because at the end of the day, that's the other side of it. It's not just that people don't feel that people are feeling forgotten and left behind. It's also that people feel like there's all these politicians in both parties who promise them the moon and the stars, and then when they get into office, they don't do anything to actually deliver for them. And Jamie Harrison, our chairman, shares this story, which I really appreciate. And he ran for the U.S. Senate a couple years back. He went up to this dirt road, and there was a house, and an elderly African American gentleman answered the door, and Jamie asked him for his vote, and the guy said no, and Jamie said, why not? And he goes, you see that dirt road? And Jamie said, yes, sir. Well, that dirt road's been a dirt road since John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, and he went through all the presidents, and at the end of it he said, until you pave that damn dirt road, I'm not going to vote for any of you. And I think that just sort of crystallizes the point that I'm trying to make. Americans, regardless of party, are very cynical, highly cynical of politicians, highly cynical of politics generally, and of government, right? The trust in institutions at an all-time low. For us to restore faith in democracy and restore their faith that government can be a catalyst for change, not just in our country, but catalyst for change within their own lives and communities, we have to deliver on the promises we make. And so that's, to me, just as important as how we campaign, is that when we come into power, we're doing what we said we would to make a difference in people's lives.
If you don't mind, I want to introduce the next person that wants to ask a question to you. Steve Holcomb and I, we met basically online about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago. We formed a relationship with each other, and we decided that we wanted to found Coffee with Democrats, and we did that in August of last year. And so Steve is our co-host. He's an attorney out of Pawhuska. And if you remember that we got a movie that's coming out, Children of the Flower Moon, about the Osage tribe. Osage Killers of the Flower Moon. I'm sorry. Anyhow, that movie is coming out, and it was staged in basically Steve's backyard. So Steve has a couple of comments or a question that he wants to ask, and make a couple of comments as well. So I want to invite Steve to be able to speak with you.
Thanks, Kevin. Good morning, Ken. It's wonderful to hear your comments. And as you were speaking, first of all, I'm from very rural Oklahoma. I live in a small town. It's about 2,500 to 3,000. And it's been hit by, all of these demographics that have hit the rural areas here over the last couple of generations. Similar, I'm sure, to a lot of rural communities in Minnesota. But as you're talking, you have, I believe you talked about your father, and he's in his 80s, and we're talking about the things that matter and are visible. And I couldn't help thinking here, even over the last 20 minutes, as you've talked about the infrastructure bill, and our president, whom on Fox News, his record is, as we all know, devastating. It's like atrocious. It's like he's not even the president, right? But he's doing these things, and he really does appear to have a wonderful vision for the entire country. And I noticed that Minnesota is getting $2.2 billion in allocations from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Oklahoma is getting $1.4 billion. And, you know, a lot of this is about messaging, but we're going to be seeing actual, you know, pavings of dirt roads, if you will, in our states. And this seems like a wonderful opportunity, notwithstanding that DNC has very little money to put into the pockets of local politicians and Democrats and candidates. That nonetheless, this is something that can be very well leveraged. And I wonder if you could, you know, speak to that.
Absolutely, and I think you're singing my tune here, because I think as Democrats we tend to agonize and do a lot of hand wringing, and we like to admire the problem, which is great, right? But we don't do enough, and partly because I think you know, we believe in the gospel that we should just you know, do good deeds and not talk about them. Right at the end of the day, I think the reality for us as Democrats is we don't talk about the great work that we're doing. There's been no president or vice president in our country's history that's done more in the 2.5 years than President Biden and Vice President Harris have done, and particularly as it relates to infrastructure that's going to help communities throughout this nation, not just rural communities, but urban communities, suburban communities. People are going to benefit tremendously. Now, you remember under Trump and the American Rescue Plan, they had signs up everywhere and all of this stuff that you know, they were trying to take credit for. You know, remember that there's been no infrastructure bill ever in this country's history that has been as large or as expansive as the one that was passed under President Biden and Vice President Harris. The Inflation Reduction Act is the largest investment in green energy and fighting climate change in this country that we've ever seen. Those two bills in particular, along with the CHIPS Act, are going to do more for rural communities than any Republican president has ever delivered. And so we have to be out there talking about what we've done. And I'll go back to my father-in-law as an example, right? These are the real world impacts of crumbling infrastructure. Right outside of his farm down in Wells, Minnesota, is a state highway, right? And that highway has been in such a deep state of disrepair that he's had to bring in smaller grain trucks to take away his crop, right? And that costs him more money at the end of the day. Well, you know, he can't bring in those big trucks anymore because the road's crumbling. And, you know, as a result of the infrastructure bill, that road is now fixed. And what I can say to him in a very personal way now, right, is look, right, look what the Democrats were able to deliver through this infrastructure bill, both our state bonding bill and our national infrastructure monies that are coming out. It's delivered something that's both tangible and real to him. And this is also the problem in messaging for Democrats, is we oftentimes talk about things through abstract numbers. Okay, we can talk about the $1.9 trillion infrastructure bill that was passed by President Biden. Well, what the hell does that mean for someone in their own community, in their own life? And so what we have to do, and I appreciate you saying this, is we have to localize the messaging. We have to make people realize that water treatment plant that they've been hoping for years down the road is going to be built because Democrats delivered, right? We have to realize that broadband, which they've been waiting for 20 years now, is going to be is going to happen because Democrats have delivered on the promise that they made, right? And a whole host of infrastructure that you can name. The reality is we need to show people that we're delivering for them and their communities. And it's not just on sort of brick and mortar infrastructure. It's also on human infrastructure. We're making investments in schools. We're making investments in education, both nationally and in states like Minnesota that we haven't before. We're delivering again on making it easier for people to live their lives, unlike the Republicans who are trying to make it harder. So I would just say this: we have to stop agonizing as Democrats, and we need to start evangelizing. We need to get out there and tell this story about what Democrats are doing, both federally with President Biden and Vice President Harris, and then in states like Minnesota, which I would argue have done more to pass an agenda to help people's lives than any other state in this country over the last year.
You know, I appreciate everything that you said on that. That was, you know, it's very profound. And I'll just add one other concept or one other idea to what you just said. Can you imagine, with the infrastructure and particularly with internet and trying to get broadband into rural places, that is going to benefit the farmer, going to benefit ag, going to benefit students, it's going to benefit everybody. Could you imagine having President Biden or Vice President Harris fly into Burns Flat, Oklahoma, very rural, very red, and promote broadband and how that's helping the people of Oklahoma, or fly into Hot Springs, Arkansas, and promote the same thing, in that tangible evangelizing coming from the top in a very red, very hostile place. It's going to start breaking down barriers. That's one of the things that I see would be very positive about that. So that
Well,
was just
Kevin, nothing against Burns Flat, but he can come to Pawhuska because we've got one of those broadband projects here with the Osage tribe, actually. And you were mentioning Killers of the Flower Moon, and I'll just make a quick plug about that. It's a Scorsese film. You all look for it in October, and it's a true to life film. Of course, it's going to be, quite dramatic. DiCaprio's in it and such, but if you are have any interest in traveling to Osage County or Pawhuska, Oklahoma after that, please look me up. But coming back to broadband, I'd love for Biden to come to Pawhuska and Osage County. It could be Biden, August in Osage County, as far as I'm concerned. But you're exactly right. That's the kind of thing we need. We need some visibility from some of the officials. It doesn't have to be Biden, but it could be Buttigieg, for crying out loud, to come to places here in rural Oklahoma and wave the flag, so to speak. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Well, let me just say, in my conversations with the White House and the DNC, the president and vice president are committed to that, to getting out to rural parts of this country, because, again, this message, they have an amazing story to tell. And I believe that the cabinet secretaries will be on the road as well. But, absent, and I think it's important. So don't get me wrong, but absent, in any given state, a trip by the president to highlight those accomplishments, we all have a part to play, right? And we can't ignore our own role in being messengers here, right? And getting that message out. Even a simple act of writing a letter to the editor, right, in your local hometown newspaper, reminding folks in your community in a very personal way how these bills and these laws are helping to impact your community is I wouldn't say as persuasive, but certainly in some ways, because they either know you or the community, and you can personalize and localize the impacts of that. It's just as effective. And frankly, that's what we need to do, because we can't just talk in these abstracts. We need to really personalize it down to the community, down to the township level, so that people know, okay, I might not have liked Joe Biden, but boy, Joe Biden likes me. He's certainly helping my community, right? And that's the piece we got to understand, that it takes all of us as messengers, and we all have to be singing from the same playbook here. Unfortunately, again, it's like what Will Rogers once said famously, and you guys all know Will Rogers, of course, but Will said, I don't belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat. And sometimes I feel like he was very prophetic. We are a big tent party, which I wouldn't trade, but as a result, it's much harder for us because we do not march lockstep like the Republicans. And as a result, on messaging, we sometimes miss the mark because we're not doing it the right way. I would just ask all of you to be active participants in delivering the message for President Biden and Vice President Harris, delivering the message for local Democrats in your state. You've got a wonderful chair in Alicia Andrews, who's doing a magnificent job of getting the message out down there. And I would just say, follow her lead, follow Scott Hamilton's lead and others from the party, follow your elected officials and others. But if you need any help, let me know. I'm always happy to come down. I'll go to, as long as there's 2 or more Democrats to meet with, I'll be there.
Well, we greatly appreciate that. We've got a very large, as you know, Coffee with Democrats is expanding. It has expanded rapidly in the United States, and we're so happy to have this opportunity to have so many people with the Coffee with Dems affiliations on here today with us. Ray from Ohio, he was actually the one who interviewed David Pepper just a few weeks ago, and did a fantastic job. He's on here, and he has a question for you that I want to go ahead and let Ray Domingo ask this question directly to you there, Ken, if you don't mind.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Ken, for being here today. We appreciate your time, and it's such an honor to talk to you. And yes, the conversation I had with David was really great conversation, and especially because of the assaults that the GOP has taken on our Constitution here in Ohio, and the will of the people to vote and to push constitutional referendums. But the question I wanted to ask you was, after the ruling of the Supreme Court's decision of the fraudulent 303 creative gay rights case and the hostile environments by states towards the LGBTQIA plus community, and President Biden's promise on the Equality Act during his 100 days in office, and Democratic control in both the House and the Senate. Now, after this ruling, what is the message to marginalized communities from the Democratic committee towards marginalized communities, candidates, and elected officials?
Well, look, I think it's a great question. And what I would say is the message is elections matter. Elections have consequences, right? And I believe so much of what we're seeing in the court, I can trace back to conversations I had in 2016 with individuals within our party and others who decided they were going to sit out an election for a whole host of reasons. They either didn't like our presidential candidate, or they voted third party, didn't vote at all. Again, what I would say is this. The president and other Democrats are actively engaged right now in a conversation about how we push back on this activist conservative court, and both from a structural and rules perspective, but also from this public opinion, which is wildly against these recent decisions, both on affirmative action, the ruling around discrimination, essentially, and so I would say national Democrats certainly are engaged in this conversation and trying to figure out the best way to respond to this conservative court, but not just respond, but ultimately taking action. But let me just say that so much of what we've seen around the country right now, where we're winning these battles, also has to be highlighted, right? Because we're not losing everywhere. And we're winning in states like Minnesota. We just passed a gender affirming care law, making us the 5th state in the union to be a trans refuge state. We banned conversion therapy. We just restored the right to vote for felons. We are doing everything we can to actually use the power we have to make it easier for people to live their lives, and particularly for marginalized and underrepresented communities, to let people know that Minnesota is a welcoming state, a state that is going to deliver on all the promises that these communities have heard for years. And we're doing that slowly but surely. And I will say, look, while we have a lot going for us, for sure, we also in Minnesota have, some of the deepest racial disparities in the nation too, that we have to address. And so the fight continues everywhere in this country to make sure that marginalized and underrepresented communities know that we haven't forgotten about them, and that we're going to continue to use the power we have when we have it to make the difference. Now, as you talk about the Equality Act, and you talk about what happened under President Biden's first 2 years with Democratic majorities, remember that those, I would say it would be a little bit of a misnomer to say that he had a majority in the U.S. Senate, right? There was a lot that we could have gotten done, but we had a Senate that wasn't completely aligned on both from a values perspective and strategy perspective of getting some of the stuff done that we wanted to. But I was on the South Lawn when the president, made sure to codify, and to continue to defend marriage equality. And I will tell you that was very important. And it was, I think, important for the LGBTQ community around the country to know that they had not only a champion, but someone who's going to fight tooth and nail against this court trying to take people's rights away.
Thank you so much for that, Ken. I appreciate it. And sorry, I'm a little nervous. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We spent quite a bit of time today referencing back to David Pepper. Can I just reassure you, Ken, that this conversation that we're having today with you is going to be a reference point going forward, that we're going to refer back. You guys remember when we had Ken Martin on here and he was talking about this? We're going to refer to this day and this conversation with you probably more so than we do David Pepper. So I want you to feel good about coming on here, because this is a fantastic opportunity for us to hear directly from you, and we value you as much as anybody that has ever been on this show. And we can't talk enough about how impactful your conversation with us is going to be going forward. At this point, with just a few more minutes left before we're just going to have to start wrapping this down, can we talk just a little bit about fun and tell us some of the funniest stories that you've been involved in while serving as the vice chair?
Well, some of them I can't repeat, but I will say we have to have fun in this work as well, because it can seem so weighty, and it is, of course, because lives are on the line. I will tell you, there's lots of great experiences that I've had as a vice chair to be able to travel the country, but truly and honestly, for me, the most rewarding part of this job has been just meeting people in every part of this country who are engaged in this work for the right reasons. It's these are the sort of everyday heroes who are working in politics or working in progressive organizations, working men and women, who are rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in their union, or, folks who are involved in organizations fighting for civil and human rights. These are people who inspire me every day. There's probably a lot of funny stories to tell, but for me, this work is very rewarding, and it's made even more rewarding the people that I meet out there. The most people sometimes give these long accolades to me when they introduce me, and the most important title for me is organizer. That's where I started 32 years ago with Paul Wellstone. It's why I'm committed to that work still. And it's what I believe passionately. That's my role. Whatever perch I'm in, the most important title is to be an organizer and to be an advocate. And I think for all of us on this call, we just need to remember that there are plenty of people in this country who feel powerless, who feel voiceless, right? None of them are powerless and none of them are voiceless, right? And it's not our job to just give a voice to them. That's not really our job. It's our job to empower them and to let them know their own agency, and to get more people involved in fighting for their democracy and fighting for issues that are going to improve people's lives. So, I know that's probably a little bit more somber than you'd like, but for me, this work is fun and enjoyable because of the people I get to meet, and frankly, there are people in every nook and cranny of this country who are fighting hard for the type of communities that we're trying to create.
Well, that's a really good reply. It's a very good answer. It's something that, again, we have to stay focused. Don't lose the focus on what we have at task. We all have a part to play. One of the things that I did want to bring up and talk to you about was, it's famously, as we all understand and remember history, we all remember in 1960 when John Kennedy was giving his inaugural speech, when he talked about, and so my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It brings up another question or another dynamic for us to talk about what can we do with each other as Democrats to help our country preserve democracy and help the Democratic Party. Do you want to? So I'm going to tie that in with another segment or another thing that I wanted to ask you to do, is kind of tie that in with your closing comments that you want to make towards us, about how we need to stay focused, laser focused on what we, the task that we have at hand.
Well, first off, let me say that I really appreciate you having me on. It's just great to be able to have this conversation. I'm always happy to come back and take more questions. So anytime you want me to come back, let me know. But let me just say this. Let me start with our, what I mentioned earlier in terms of a call to action. Oftentimes people think of action and these takeaways as, you have to do something big and grandiose to make change, and that's not true. And I go back to what I said earlier about Confucius is saying that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. I also, one of my favorite quotes is from Margaret Mead, who said, "Never underestimate the power of one person to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And meaning that each of us has a responsibility to remake the world daily, right? We can remake the world daily, not through grand acts, but just through small acts of getting out there, even if it's just talking to your neighbor about local politics, or even if it's just writing a letter to the editor, or getting out and marching in a parade, or standing in a grocery store with a campaign t-shirt on, right? There's a million different ways you can take action every single day. And I would encourage you and all of your listeners to realize their own agency and their power to make a difference in their community. And that's where it all starts. And suddenly, if we're all doing that every single day, doing something to make a difference, it will be amazing what we're able to accomplish. And I will say this, I know there's frustration with the Democratic Party. As I've said earlier, I have my own frustration. I'm a national officer. But I want to remind your listeners that, nothing that's ever good that's happened in the Democratic Party it hasn't happened organically. It's happened because people from the outside and others have pushed the party to be better. And we're coming up on the 75th anniversary of Hubert Humphrey's speech in Philadelphia in 1948. And for those of your listeners who don't know this speech, it changed the Democratic Party for good. He introduced a platform plank to basically put the Democratic Party on the side of civil rights and voting rights. The platform committee voted it down, and Hubert Humphrey, a young mayor of Minneapolis at the time, took that platform plank to the floor as a minority report. He built support for it, and it passed. And he got up on the floor of that convention, July 14th, 1948 in Philadelphia, and he said, "It's time for the Democratic Party to come out of the shadows of state rights and march forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights and civil rights." And of course, all the Dixiecrats, all those racist Democrats from the South got up and they left our party for good. And it changed our party. It cemented our party as a party of civil rights. And of course, 20 years later, passing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, it would not have happened without our party and people from the outside pushing our party to be better. Same with the equal rights support and reproductive rights support in the 70s. And in 2012, I was proud to be one of the authors of putting a platform plank forward on recognizing marriage equality. Reality is our party only evolves with people like your listeners and others on this call who care deeply about seeing us stand up and fight for the type of communities we want to see, and fight for people's rights, and fight for the things that we want to see our party standing up for. So I would say this again. Start with those small steps, but realize all of that together makes a difference. And when you get frustrated with the Democratic Party, don't give up on it. Get more involved. Change it to make it the party that you can be proud of, and keep pushing all of us as national leaders to do the work we need to build in your community. So again, thank you so much for having me on, and I look forward to a future invite.
We're so grateful to you. You've taken enormous amount of time out of your day and your schedule to be with us and to talk with us. And we know that this has, had some impact on your schedule, and we are so grateful to you for doing that. We are going to have some follow-up questions to you. Calais, who is our co-host as well as one of our affiliates in Arkansas, we want to invite you to a summit in Arkansas that David Pepper's going to be at, and it's going to be a very dynamic summit in Arkansas, again, to raise awareness about democracy and saving democracy and spreading the democratic word. So thank you so much for being on with us today. It's such an honor. So, it's so huge of an honor for us to actually have you with us. And we are so grateful. So for everybody who is listening, this isn't going to be our last conversation with Ken. We plan on having more conversations in the future. We aren't going to have Ken on every week. That's not going to be possible. His schedule is going to be way too busy for that. But maybe in a couple of months, we're going to try to reach out to Ken and get him on here again. Next week, we're going to have a very special guest. Daniel Jackson is candidate for Georgia's 12th congressional district. We're going to have him on having a conversation next week. So again, thank you, Ken. We are so grateful, so appreciative. I can't speak highly enough about how we are so impressed with everything that you had to say. And just like I said before, we've made a lot of comments about, one of our great guests that we've had on in the past. We're going to have that same conversation with many of our guests in the future about, do you remember on July 6th, we had a conversation with Ken Martin, and this is what he had to say. So we really appreciate you, man.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks to all your listeners. And I look forward to the next conversation. And please send us some ideas. We need ideas, thoughts, and any good constructive criticism. I always like to hear it because, at the end of the day, I'll just leave you with this, what Paul Wellstone used to say: we all do better when we all do better. Let's keep that in mind as we do this work. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
All right, everybody. We have had just a wonderful, outstanding conversation with Ken Martin. It's just a great pleasure of mine to have this conversation with him. Please join us back next week as we have Coffee with Democrats with Daniel Jackson. It's going to be a very good conversation. He's a candidate out of Georgia. He's a veteran, somebody that really we should be looking to, that's going to help Georgia and bring Georgia further into the blue side. So everybody, if you will, come back and join us next week as we have that conversation. Until then, everybody, please be safe.